Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
There was a time not too long ago when the road to winning the NBA championship went through St. Louis. Yep, St. Louis. In fact, had it not been for St. Louis's NBA franchise capitulating to league demands, the NBA might actually look very different than it does now. Heck, there might not even be a Boston Celtics. It's not as far-fetched as you might think. The demise of the Celtics was very real, and in the end, St. Louis saving the Celtics contributed heavily to the end of the NBA in St. Louis. Next, on Sports Forgotten Heroes, Greg Maracek, founder of the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame and former voice of many St. Louis teams, joins the podcast for a look back at one of the NBA's most dominant teams from not so long ago, the St. Louis Hawks.
This is Sports Forgotten Heroes, a tribute to the stars who shaped the games we love to watch and the games we love to play. Stars who provided us with many thrills, but when their time was up, they faded away. We'll take a look back at their spectacular careers, their moments of fame, even if it was just for one season or just one game. And now, here's your host, Warren Rogan.
Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. Hope everyone had a great holiday season and a wonderful new year. I'm really excited to bring you this episode of Sports Forgotten Heroes about the St. Louis Hawks. They were one of the NBA's most dominant teams, and had it not been for the Hawks, the Boston Celtics might not exist today. That's a fact. Bill Russell might never have gone to Boston. The Celtics might have folded, and who knows where the legend of Red Auerbach might have been made. And while it's a huge part of the history of the St. Louis Hawks, there is so much more to their phenomenal story that now plays in Atlanta. And joining us in just a moment will be Greg Maracek, the founder of the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame and former voice of the St. Louis Blues, the St. Louis University Billikens, and owner of several St. Louis area radio stations. Now, before we get to today's show, a quick reminder, you can follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on Twitter at SportsFHeroes. Look for the Sports Forgotten Heroes page on Facebook or check out our website, sportsfh.com. When you visit, you can read more about our guests. We have links to articles and videos about our subject, like the St. Louis Hawks. You can drop us a note, suggest topics for future shows, ask questions, or more. Also, especially, if you enjoy Sports Forgotten Heroes and listen on Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star rating. Everything helps as we continue to uncover heroes from yesteryear whom time has forgotten, like today's topic, the St. Louis Hawks. A team that appeared in the NBA Finals 4 times in 5 years and won the NBA championship in 1958. A team that one of the NBA's greatest played for, Bob Pettit. A team that other such greats as Cliff Hagan and Easy Ed Macaulay played for. A team that bowed down to the wishes of the league office and let its coach leave and go to Boston. That agreed not to draft Bill Russell. And a team that wowed its fans for much of the 1950s and into the 1960s. But it was also a team that had to deal with significant racial issues and a team that inexplicably never found itself in the good graces of city leaders like its fellow professional sports franchises, the Cardinals and later the Blues. In fact, it got so bad for the Hawks that it had to purchase its own 24-second clocks because the city wouldn't outfit the arena. So, why were the Hawks, a team that the city of St. Louis welcomed, with such open arms. A team that won the NBA championship in 1958 and nearly won multiple other titles, ultimately treated as the city's ugly, red-headed stepsister and forced to move away. Well, Greg Maracek, the founder of the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame and former voice of several St. Louis area sports teams, is here to tell us more. Greg, thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Welcome to the show.
Warren, I appreciate it very much, and I can talk about the Hawks all day long.
Awesome. Well, let's start with this first. Tell us a little bit about yourself. The teams you've called play-by-play for, the radio stations you've owned, the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame, and where your love for the St. Louis Hawks comes from.
Well, let's do the last first. And yeah, I've been very, very fortunate to know so many people in sports here and get a start with a newspaper here and having played college baseball here and whatnot. So I met the right people to get into the business, and people who were willing to help me start different companies. So it's been a great source of pride, and that I've been able to get it done for this city. But let's start with the interest in the Hawks, where it came from. It was pretty simple. My father was a sports fanatic, and he was a senior vice president of a manufacturing firm. So consequently, he got virtually season tickets to the sports teams that we did have. And remember, we only had the Cardinals at this time.
Right,
we didn't have a football team. We didn't have anything else.
Right, and that's the football Cardinals. I mean, and that's the baseball
the baseball Cardinals.
The baseball Cardinals, right.
And even then, that was, in 1954, when the Baltimore Orioles Baltimore was going to take over the Browns, the Cardinals were actually going to move to Houston. It was pretty much a done deal.
I didn't know
because there was
that.
no one here to buy the team. Remember, Fred Sy had been indicted and put in jail for fraud. He owned the Cardinals, and part of the sentence was he had to sell the team. And, of course, the league wanted him to sell the team, and there was nobody to buy the team. So it was all but done, and at the last minute, some city fathers begged and convinced Mr. Bush to get involved in saving the team for the city after its great history in the early part of the century. And he didn't know a hockey puck from a basketball from a baseball, but he did it because he knew it would be good for selling beer. And so they were here, and then right on their tails comes this other opportunity. And the Hawks came from Milwaukee. Well, before Milwaukee, they were at
Tri-Cities.
Tri-Cities, that's right. They were the Tri-City Blackhawks, and then became the Milwaukee Hawks. Then came here. So it came down to the opening night, 1955, November the 5th. I was 6 years old, and actually it was a day game. And my dad said, "I'm going to take you to a basketball game." Well, I didn't know much what it was. Yeah, and we went down to Kiel Auditorium, and he's telling me all about what they do. And he said, "Now you're going to see a game where they can score over 100 points." And I said, "What? No. I was used to baseball, 6-4.
Greg, I got to interrupt for a second. That is the funniest thing, because I remember my first ever basketball game. My father took me to Madison Square Garden to see the New York Knicks against the Baltimore Bullets, and he said, "Watch this, you're going to score over 100 points," and I was flabbergasted.
Well, there you are. Well, in fact, I said no to the point that he bet me. He made a bet, and he said, "Greg, if they don't score 100 points, I'm going to owe you a chocolate sundae," and vice versa. Of course, I didn't have any money, but so anyway, it's the Minneapolis Lakers, who were tremendous at that time, and our new St. Louis Hawks, and sure enough, Both teams scored over 100. It was, I believe it was 110 to 105, something like that. And I was, same thing, I was just shocked. But had the greatest time of my life and got hooked on him quickly. Because, when Ben Kerner, he didn't bring us with an empty cupboard when he came from Milwaukee.
No.
He came with two great pros, Charlie Scher at center, and, of course, Big Blue Bob Pettit, one of the great forwards of all time, came to St. Louis. So we got an Albert Pujols right out of the gate.
That's awesome. What about, you've called play-by-play for some of the teams, and tell me about the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame.
Well, yeah, I did. While I was being a sports writer, I decided I wanted to get into the broadcast business somehow. Got, again, some great help, and ended up starting a production company called SNI Sports Network. And the SNI stood for the three letters of the newspaper for which I worked. Oh. And the publisher there was kind enough to pick up all the bills for me to get started. Did that for 2 years. As long as I would stay as the chief columnist for the newspaper.
Uh-huh.
So it was a deal, and I went about buying rights to things. And at first, I bought the rights to St. Louis University basketball and St. Louis University hockey, and I did the play-by-play on both of those on radio for both teams, and then we did some television for hockey. And I resurrected a TV contract for the Billikens. I didn't do the games, but I arranged for it. So I did that, and having done Billiken hockey, it came to the point where the Blues came. Now we're going to have a third team.
Right.
And the Blues came in 1966, and Dan Kelly, who was the great play-by-play voice of the Blues, one night his color man wasn't going to show up. And he called me. I was actually at a friend's house. Playing pool, by the way. And he called me and he said, "Greg, are you coming to the game tonight?" I said, "Nah, I wasn't going to come." He said, "Well, you are now." He said, "I think you're the only one who knows enough hockey in town to help me. I need a color man. Otherwise, I won't have a break all night." So I jumped in the car, went down to the arena, and walked into the KMOX booth. And that was scary. Because here I am doing a game with Dan Kelly.
Sure.
In the National Hockey League. And the first time he threw the mic to me after a goal, I didn't say a thing. I was silent. And he laughed, and he threw it to commercial. He said, "We'll be back in a moment here on KMOX. This is St. Louis Blues hockey." And he said, "Don't worry, you'll talk next time." And sure enough, then I talked all night, and he decided he liked me better than the other guy and got me the job. And the other guy didn't mind. He didn't want to do it really anyway. So then I merged into being the play-by-play voice of the Blues, because Dan Kelly was moved to radio only in St. Louis. KMOX wouldn't allow him to do TV, a competitor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I did Blues hockey, and then I had already done St. Louis Stars professional soccer in the North American Soccer League with Frank Lieber, the old CBS voice of the Dallas Cowboys.
Oh, wow.
And that was a real treat, too. And the big one was getting the Missouri Tigers, and I did the play-by-play for Missouri basketball throughout Norm Stewart's run of championships.
Oh, wow.
And I also did some TV there. We actually quite a bit of TV for Missouri. In great years when they had great teams. So it was fun. I can tell you this, you never get used to it, even though it got to the point where I'm doing a lot of games for different teams. And that's why I resigned from it to concentrate just on production and writing and doing other things, because my young son had been born and he barely knew me. In fact, my wife said, he only knows you when you're on TV. And he walks up to the screen and he talks to you. So I said, well, that's enough.
Yeah.
That's enough. So that's the time that I called it off. But the great thrill was, I'd stand there. Noel Picard was my color man. great old Montreal Canadian.
Mm-hmm.
And I just remember different nights, and one in particular, we're standing in Madison Square Garden and listening to the national anthem before the face-off in the quarterfinal round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. And I whispered to Noel, I said, "Noel, pinch me." And he goes, "What?" I said, "Pinch me." And he did. I said, "Ow, that hurt." He said, "Well, you say pinch you." I said, "Well, I just wanted to make sure I was really here, because I can't believe that here I am doing the play-by-play to hundreds of thousands of people in St. Louis with their professional hockey team in the Stanley Cup playoffs."
That's awesome.
It was a thrill.
That's awesome. But, of course, today we're talking about the St. Louis Hawks. And,
Yes.
I've always thought that the New York Knicks, the Boston Celtics, and the Golden State Warriors, who were originally the Philadelphia Warriors, are the only three original franchises left in the NBA. But can a case be made for the Hawks? I mean, after all, they started in what was called, I believe, the National Basketball League. Or were they in...
Right, exactly. Right. It was called the Basketball Association of America.
Right. They came from the Basketball Association of America, the BAA, and there was the second league, the National Basketball League, which was the Knicks, the Celtics, and the Warriors. So they started off in Tri-Cities. They went on to Milwaukee, then St. Louis, and then Atlanta. At worst, very few NBA fans probably know of the Hawks' history and just how old the franchise is. So could an argument be made that they are actually an original team?
Oh, absolutely. No question. They were there. And, of course, they actually, they came from, we say Tri-Cities. They actually came from Buffalo.
That's right.
Remember,
That's
they were in Buffalo and went to Tri-Cities. And from there, so yeah, they were playing at the same time that those other teams, the Knicks, the Celtics, Philadelphia, even Washington and Toronto had teams in in those leagues, and we actually won. We were the St. Louis Bombers.
Yep.
And that was the original team before the Hawks came. The Bombers played 4 seasons and won a championship once and was close to another star, but it just didn't take. And, of course, the whole league didn't take.
Right.
The only thing that came out of that was that Ed McCauley became a star at St. Louis University, and he was carrying the day to keep the Bombers alive.
And then he ended up on, I think, Boston and then back to St. Louis. But we'll get to that. Why did the Hawks move from Milwaukee to St. Louis? And how much did baseball play a role in the Hawks leaving Milwaukee and the fact that all St. Louis had was a baseball team, and that actually might have helped St. Louis land the Hawks?
Well, that's right. It still was a gutsy move by the owner, Ben Kerner, who actually had no other business interest except the Hawks, to which he said he was always losing money. And what got him was that one day, and Bob Pettit tells the story the best, one day the Hawks had a dramatic victory in Milwaukee over the New York Knicks. And it would have been in the Sunday newspaper, and they never beat a team like the Knicks in Milwaukee. They were because they were so bad. And here he gets the paper to read about his game story, and instead of his game story being on the front page, there was a headline that Billy Bruton from the Milwaukee Braves had bagged a dozen quail. And he said, that's it. Because he didn't find a Hawk story for about 4 or 5 pages. And he said, we got to get out of here.
Yeah, I could understand that.
And then they were courted by the great sports editor of the Globe Democrat here in St. Louis, Bob Burns, to come and play a practice game and see if they could sell tickets. And it worked. And they came down even on a holiday in March and sold tickets, drew 8,000 people for a exhibition.
Wow.
And he said, that's good enough for me. If you'll take the team, we'll come.
Interesting. How hard was it for Ben to convince the other owners to let him move from Milwaukee to St. Louis?
Well, apparently it wasn't hard because it couldn't have been worse. Uh-huh. The skeptics were the national media, which said, "Why would you go to a city that had already lost a hockey team in the St. Louis Flyers?"
Uh-huh.
Were just had lost the St. Louis Browns,
right,
who went to Baltimore.
Right.
And again, we're back to having only had a baseball team again.
Right.
That was the only franchise we had. So he proved them wrong, of course, because the Hawks took off, and they took off because they won a lot, and they won early.
Yep. Why did they move from St. Louis to Atlanta? I mean, after all, on the court, as you just said, they were pretty successful, weren't they?
Yeah, 13 seasons here, 12 seasons in the playoffs, 4 trips to the championship round, 1 world championship. It's like 10 conference titles. I mean, they were tremendous. 8 Hall of Famers. So we had a great team, but there were 2 issues going on here in our city. One was, and you know what? Our city hasn't changed that much in this way. Our city's still divided and getting new resources for sports teams, but they refused to upgrade Kiel Auditorium where the Hawks played. And while it was a beautiful site, and they had these when you went to Kiel to play a game, it was like you're watching a play in a theater because all the lights would be off except the candles right over the court.
Oh,
there are no lights in the crowd, and it was fabulous. It was intimidating. But he wanted to upgrade. He needed more. He needed the broken seats fixed. He needed a suite or 2 made. He needed something else to keep the crowds. And we had standing room only almost every night. But he could see it coming with a hockey team coming, that this is going to get really difficult. So they refused. They wouldn't help him. They did, however, help the hockey team get here by upgrading the St. Louis Arena, and that really irritated him. He actually had to buy his own 24-second shot clock for the end, which was a league rule. I mean, he had 24 seconds to shoot. The city said, "We're not buying those." So he had to buy them, and he also bought the scoreboard at center court.
Wow.
They wouldn't do that either.
Wow.
I mean, ridiculous stuff that the city wouldn't help him with expenses, and yet he was only the second pro team that had come in and was filling the house and giving them national recognition.
Right. They were, like we said, really successful. Is there much talk about the Hawks today? I mean, do people even know they once had an NBA franchise and an NBA franchise
only if
that won a championship?
You got to be older than we got to be about 50 years old, or you just explored the history of St. Louis and found it. Which is why I did the books and why I put a beautiful display downtown at the hockey arena commemorating the Hawks, full of stuff. And I just watch the kids come in, and they don't know what they're looking at. I love to go up and talk to them and say, you missed this. This was really something. You asked me why they left, and there was a second major issue, and it can't be skirted around. We definitely had racial problems.
Yeah, you write about that in your book.
Yeah, African-American athletes were not welcome, even the baseball players. In 1964, when the Cardinals won their first World Series in 18 years and went to have a post-game all-night party at the biggest hotel in town that Mr. Bush had set up, the Sheraton Jefferson Hotel downtown, they all went to the party except the African-American players were stopped at the door, and Bob Gibson, and without them, we don't win anything, by the way. Bob Gibson, Bill White, and Kurt Flood couldn't come to the party.
That's crazy.
So Stan Musial found out about that. He was inside, and he said, you get the owner of the Sheraton Jefferson on the phone. And they did. And he talked to him. He said, well, He said, "I'm sorry, Stan, but if I do that, I'm going to lose other customers." And so, fine. So Stan said, "Fine, we're shutting this down and we're leaving immediately. Any of the expenses that have been tallied up so far are yours to take care of." And of course, Stan had a restaurant across town, Musial and Biggie's. So he called there, and it was full of people. And he said, "Just apologize to all the people. Tell them they need to be out of there in 1 hour. And I'm also going to give a free dinner to each of them to come back."
Wow.
And they went there for the night. So that was our other problem. I know players who were trying to sell season tickets were rebuffed by even corporations who said, "There's just too many African Americans on the team. I can't sell this."
That's crazy. That's unreal. And yet today, we still see some of that. It's amazing. I've done several podcasts where we talk about how race was such an issue so long ago. And it's crazy to think that race, in many instances, is still present today.
Yeah, they actually people would say, well, it wouldn't be so bad if so much of their body wasn't exposed.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
Wrap them up in clothes, and maybe it's okay.
Yeah. Well, let's not go down that rabbit hole. Let's talk about the Hawks. Here's a team that was a perennial loser. They moved from Milwaukee to St. Louis and wind up making the playoffs their first year in St. Louis.
Right.
And then they almost pull off the unthinkable and make it to the NBA Finals by going up 2-0 on the Fort Wayne Pistons in the division finals. But then the Pistons storm back and they take the last 3 games and move on to the finals. But wow, what a first year. Can you tell us a little bit about that year?
What was to come?
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about that first year and then what happened in the playoffs?
Well, yeah, when they first started playing here, Ben was a little worried that, oh my God, it might be another Milwaukee because nobody's come to the games. And they were drawing 2,000 or 3,000 a game. And all of a sudden they started winning. And then Bob Pettit was obviously on his way to a record-setting season. And that's really opened the door and attracted people. And then once they were going down the stretch and it looked like they definitely could make the playoffs, people got excited. Again, they were the only game in town in the wintertime.
Sure.
So, and we had picked up a great star from the Celtics in Cliff Hagan. And of course, that was a great coup because we weren't going to get Bill Russell anyway. There was no chance.
I want to get into that whole story and he'd
already told the Hawks he wasn't going to come if they drafted him. He was going to sit out another year and go back in the draft.
Right.
So Ben gets a call from the Celtics because they're going out of business. They were in bad shape.
Which is just...
They're drawing 1,000 or 2,000 a game.
Crazy to think that the Boston Celtics were almost gone.
Right. I mean, Maurice, I believe it was Podloff, who was the commissioner, called the Hawks, called Ben and said, "We need your help. We got to save the Celtics."
Yeah.
And he said, "I'm going to ask you for a favor. Will you trade with them to give them the draft choice so they can get Bill Russell?"
Right. But there had to be another there was another piece to that. But let's go back to that in a second. Let's continue on about this first year where really the Hawks come out of nowhere because they were not very good in Milwaukee and they pushed the Pistons to the limit. And that was a sign of things to come. And they became a very competitive team during their time in St. Louis. And I guess, let's get to it. What happened after that first year in St. Louis had such a profound impact on the NBA? So I have a series of questions here that all relate to the Hawks and just how this team really helped shape the game we watch today. Because my questions revolve around Red Auerbach, Bill Russell, the Boston Celtics, the Rochester Royals, and of course, the Hawks. So let's start with this first. Red Auerbach. He was actually at one time the coach of the Hawks in Milwaukee, but if I read correctly, the NBA wanted him in Boston. Can you talk about how Auerbach got to Boston?
No, you're correct. You're correct. And Ben didn't mind that because Ben didn't like him. Ben didn't want a challenger to his power. Ben was going to be the Jerry Jones of the day. He was the owner, the general manager, and he's not going to have some coach. And Red, even then, was a kind of a loudmouth guy. He got things revved up, and so he said, "Sure, I'll make a deal to get him to Boston."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and then of course we had Red Holzman,
right,
as the first coach here, and Red didn't do very well. He held them together, but they needed more, and Alex Hannum was the guy.
Right. And Hannum really, took the Hawks to that next level. But before we get to Alex, Boston, as we were just talking about, was actually struggling. And there was talk that the Celtics might actually fold. Auerbach and the NBA wanted Russell in Boston. And here's the key. Rochester owned the first pick of the 1956 draft. The Hawks were second, and the Celtics were third.
So getting the Hawks pick wasn't an assurance that you were going to get Russell either, although he was going to be traded anyway because they didn't think they could keep him either.
Mm-hmm. Well, and they didn't have to worry about it because Rochester ended up selecting Cy Green. St. Louis took Russell, but the trade had already been worked out where the Celtics would send Ed McCauley to St. Louis and Cliff Hagan to St. Louis. Talk about this entire situation and how important it was to get Russell to Boston and the talent that Boston gave up to go to St. Louis and why Rochester ultimately selected Cy Green.
Well, that's a question for another day. Who in the heck made that decision? I was out of his mind, but it did help save the Celtics. And really, the deal was that, and Ben was such a sly guy. The deal was McCauley for the draft pick for Russell, hopefully. And McCauley didn't want to come back. A St. Louis native, a great star at St. Louis U, an All-American. St. Louis U won the national championship, their one and only time. And but he was doing. He was already 7 seasons with the Celtics. He was been All-Pro 3 or 4 of those, and he was very popular up there. And he said to Red, ask him. Well, no, it was actually the owner, Walter Brown. Asked him would he go to St. Louis, and he said no.
Why?
He didn't want to come to St. Louis, even though it was home, because he was doing so well in Boston. He didn't want to have to start over, and he looked at the Hawks going, plus you're sending me to a team that's just trying to get it together and on the rise. But, the Celtics were going to be great with Cousy and Sharman and all the other guys. But then
happened.
What happened, of course, was the very sad story of Ed went home and got a call from his wife, said, you need to come home. And they went to our children's hospital there and found out that their young son, their baby, had spinal meningitis, and he wasn't going to live.
Yeah.
And, in those days, they just didn't have the deal. Well, he ended up living 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
But still, that was enough for Ed to go back to Walter Brown and said, go ahead and trade me. I need to go home.
Right.
So it's kind of quirky how all these stories work out. But then Ben still didn't approve the deal Red just straight on up. And he had to dangle another carrot out there and said, Red, if you want this deal to close, I need another player because Russell's going to be a superstar. You got to give me more than McCauley. And Red went nuts. I mean, he thought the deal was over and all that. And then when Ben Kerner asked for Cliff Hagan, they said, "Well, we're not going to give Cliff. He'd been a star at Kentucky, and he's going to be a star in the NBA. We can't give you two of those guys." And he said, "Well, then there's no deal." And well, they came back, of course, and they said, "All right, we'll do the deal." And it was the right deal for us. Because, again, we weren't going to ever get Russell anyway, yet he was smart enough to figure out if we got a couple of stars, talented guys to go along with the rest of this crew, we might have a shot.
Right.
And, of course, both of those guys are in the Hall of Fame today. And actually, in our championship season, the leading scorer, people think of Bob all the time, of Pettit, the leading scorer of the championship series was Cliff Hagan.
Right, right. And, the other thing that I find interesting, if I follow this all correctly, did Cy Green wind up on St. Louis as well later on? Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, later on he did.
It's just, what a fascinating series of events. Now, I also have to scratch my head and think to myself, take race out of the picture, and that's a big thing to take out of the picture. But
right.
One could only imagine what would have happened if the Hawks decided to draft and keep Russell, and Russell decides, okay, I'll play for St. Louis. There might not even be a Boston Celtics team anymore. And the St. Louis Hawks might have become one of the most storied franchises in NBA history. I mean... Yeah,
if they could have got it done.
Yeah. It's just...
If they could have got it done. Now, the league did one other thing for Boston. They created the All-Star game. There wasn't an All-Star game. And they said, we got to do something special for Boston. Or, again, we got to get this thing built up fast. So they started the NBA All-Star game, put it in Boston for the first year. It was a big success. And the funny part is, of course, Ed McCauley was on the All-Star team for the Western Conference, and Ed's great. Ed was had a terrific game. Scored 24 points, about 8 or 10 rebounds. Just had a terrific game for those days. And the players, he said, we didn't practice or anything. We'd all gotten left our cities, went on trains, went to Boston, got there a couple hours before the game, warmed up and played the game. Turned around, and we were on the train as soon as possible, back. That was it. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, Ed gets a letter in the mail from the NBA, and they said, Ed, this is to notify you that the Basketball Writers Association, who had covered the All-Star game, decided it would also help our league if they would start a Most Valuable Player award for the All-Star game, and you have been selected as the first winner of the Most Valuable Player award. And I said, well, where's the boat? I mean, and the cars. What'd you get? He said, no, I just got that letter. And I said, unbelievable. So anyway, that's in the 8-10 years ago, I did a kind of a spoof on the whole deal, but it also brought the Hawks further back to life here down at our big Missouri Athletic Club. I put on a tribute to Ed McCauley, and we had the NBA make a new trophy. And it was the exact duplicate of the one that he would have received.
Oh, wow.
Back in those days, with all the winged angels on the side, and it stands about 4 feet tall. It's currently in my house. But it's going to be going back to the Hall of Fame. But yeah, so it was funny that he was the first guy and was the first awardee of the Most Valuable Player award.
Crazy. Wow,
and that, again, helped story. Boston survive. And then the Hawks Celtics series, you're right, is truly what saved the NBA, because it was the first time the television got interested. Yeah, the teams were so evenly matched, and the games were so good that it was in Game 2 in the 56-57 season that NBC called them and said we're interested in televising the rest of the championship series. And they did. And it brought it to national television for the first time. They paid $15,000 for the rights.
Yeah, I thought that there was something there about Boston. Was it this series where Boston didn't want NBC to televise it because had NBC televised the game, the owners of Boston, I guess Walter Brown, thought, well, my fans will stay home, so I'm not going to make the kind of money I want to make. So they had to come up with some sort of fee to give Boston for the rights to televise that series to make good on the tickets that Boston felt it wouldn't sell because the game was on TV.
Right, and they did. They sold all the tickets.
and they got paid.
It was wildly successful. Those double overtime games, those 2 years, was just tremendous and gave the NBA a name on a national scale.
Yeah, the whole dynamic between St. Louis and Boston is so interesting because the NBA works with both teams to make these trades to get Auerbach to Boston, to get Russell to Boston. Macaulay and Hagan go to the Hawks. The Hawks, who had been perennial losers. Boston, who was a team that was in danger of folding. These two teams end up playing each other 4 out of 5 years in the NBA Finals. I mean, it was just it's such an interesting time. And you had already referred to 57. The Hawks were in the Western Conference, a weak Western Conference at the time. They were something like 34-38 and 57, but they swept Minneapolis in the division finals, and then they advanced to the NBA Finals to take on the Celtics. What a great series. And I think St. Louis surprised so many people by pushing the Celtics to 7 games. Tell us about the 57 NBA Finals and just how great it was. And some say that Game 7 ranks as one of, if not, the greatest games ever to be played in the finals. Can you tell us a little more about the series and that game number 7?
Sure, and actually it was Game 6. They won 4 games to 2.
Game 6, okay.
Yeah, and of course they had won the first 2 games in Boston, as they had been doing each of the year, and then they'd come home and lose. And again, Cliff Hagan was the absolute star of that series.
Mm-hmm.
He helped Bob Pettit so much because he was just as big a threat, and you couldn't just key off on one because then you get the other. But going into Game 6, after leaving Boston, Bob Pettit said, we've got to win Game 6 at home. We can't go back to Boston. We can't think that the miracle's going to continue and us keep winning at the Boston Garden.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to play our hearts out to win this Game 6 at home. And it was an incredible game. I was fortunate. I was small. Still, I think I was 10 or 11 years old, but I'm sitting about 3 rows behind the bench. And it was just a fantastic basketball game that went back and forth and back and forth. And the best story out of it, of course, and you probably saw it in the book, was when there was a timeout called with a little less than 5 minutes to play by the Celtics, and the Celtics are up a couple of points. And the Hawks get in the huddle, and Alex Hannum, who's a fiery coach, and he's drawn on the floor with a piece of chalk. Bob Pettit never went into those huddles. Bob said, I always just stayed on the perimeter and kind of peeked into what he was doing. And but this time, as Ed Macaulay told me, but many times, that Bob put his arm on the shoulder of Ed Macaulay and his other arm on the shoulder of Cliff Hagan, and he said, boys, excuse me, parted the ways, went into the middle of the huddle, and on his hands and knees was Alex Hannum, and Alex said, Bob, do you have something to add? And with that, Bob, who again never gestured or did anything like that, slammed his open hand on the court. And they all kind of jumped up, and he said, "Alex, just give me the gosh darn ball." And, of course, he said it a little stronger than that.
Yeah, sure.
But that's what he said. He said, so as they walked out, Ed McCauley went out with the guys on the court, and he went to each player, and he said, "You heard the boss." He said, "If any of you takes any shot but a layup, I'm going to break your arm." And sure enough, it worked. One shot was taken besides Bob. It was a layup by Slater Martin. Otherwise, Bob scores 19 of the final 21 points in the game, and we win by a single point, 110 to 109. And the city goes crazy. And Boston was just shocked that they lost. They were shocked.
Right. So 58, of course, was the magical year.
It was.
And the crazy thing is, if fans of the NBA were looking back to see who won titles every year, they would see that basically at that time, Boston won the title every year, except for once. A team from St. Louis.
Right. And prior to that, the Minneapolis Lakers were dominant.
Right. A team from St. Louis, you got to be kidding me. Well, the Hawks were the NBA champions. They had just relocated a couple years earlier, were perennial losers, and had soared to the top of the basketball world. I mean, it's incredible. And this is a team that actually went to the finals 4 out of 5 years, 57, 58, 60, 61. They won in 58. Just how good were they? And were they connecting at that time with their hometown fans? What was the relationship like between St. Louis fans and the team?
Well, they were the biggest human beings in town. And they would walk down the street of what at that time was a bustling downtown here. And here comes 3 6'9" guys walking down the street. And people instantly knew who they were.
Mm-hmm.
And like Bob said, we didn't have to buy lunch or dinner. Somebody would always pick up our tabs.
Right, I'm sure.
We were genuinely the toast of the town. At the time, the Cardinals were not very good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, back in the 50s, the Cardinals were a team that would finish 7th out of 8 teams in the National League. And had they not had Stan the Man, nobody would have gone to the games. They're only drawing 8,000 a game.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Hawks were drawing more than that.
Wow.
Obviously playing a lot less games, but they were outdrawing the Cardinals.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout the NBA playoffs, the Hawks got the headlines every day, the top headlines, and the Cardinals would be somewhere else in the sports section. So they were dominant. They were close knit. They all became great friends afterwards. There were certain haunts that they went to after games here, and they had, the Hawks had a great advantage too at Kiel Auditorium. Bob Cousy said to me, he says, we hated to go to St. Louis because he said they had that row of men on that first row. And he said, besides the lights, you're such the focus of attention because of the lighting.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got this whole row. You got players you got fans with their feet on the court, and they're sitting next to the coach or to the owner, and they are the biggest business guys in town, but they only got the seats because they were loudmouth.
Huh.
And Ben said, if you're willing to get all over the referees and get all over the other team, I'll give you first row tickets.
Wow.
He did, and they were known as Murderers Row.
What a great time to be a fan of a basketball team, because
and they're all smoking.
Yeah, that's right. They were all smoking. Yeah. That's right. The arenas. I remember looking at footage of many of the arenas, and there was always a cloud of smoke.
Oh yeah.
Different time.
Now the players would smoke at halftime. They would.
Yeah, they would. Hey, let's talk about some of the key figures of those teams. And one of the greatest players of all time and one of the greatest players ever was Bob Pettit. Tell us
Yes.
about Bob, certainly one of the league's forgotten superstars. And you can't start a discussion about the St. Louis Hawks without first discussing Bob Pettit.
Well, that's right, and that keeps the Hawks alive in nationally today in history. You hear his name once the playoffs come. You usually hear his name a couple, 3 times, and he's often in the stands. He's in his mid-80s. He still stands 6'9". He hasn't bent over at all. He has no illnesses or disease, and in fact, his wife and he traveled the country playing in bridge tournaments.
Oh, wow.
So I said, "Boy, you come a long way."
From the NBA
But he
to
was
bridge.
he was a quiet leader. He was just determined. You know, Bob was the first guy that they knew of who actually employed a workout trainer in the off season.
Yeah, I was going to get
And he
about
went out to San Diego,
there, yeah.
California, and trained with the guy in the off season just to build dexterity and strength. And Slater Martin said it really worked because when Slater Martin got here from the Knicks, he said he said around the league, you knew that when Bob Pettit got a rebound, if you could get close enough to him, you could slap the ball out of his hands. He said he came back the first time from that trainer, and it was like hitting an iron post. You couldn't get that ball out of his hands unless you had a needle to deflate it, because it was he put 2 hands on the ball and he dared you to try to take it, and that's why the guy averaged 16 rebounds a game for his career.
Wow.
26 points per game, 16 rebounds, half dozen assists. And, the one little known fact that every time the NBA Finals are on, I call whichever network has got it. I know guys at most of those, and I say, you guys keep forgetting. You talk about these greats who played in the NBA Finals, and it's Elgin Baylor, and it's Jerry West, and it's Bob Cousy, and it's Will Chamberlain, and all the others. I said, you keep forgetting the one great statistics that Bob Pettit owns, and he still has it today. He is the leading scorer of all time in an NBA Finals championship game where his team won. He scored 50 points in that last game, Game 6, and that has never been broken.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. That's awesome. And
Yeah, where's King James or Jabbar or any of those guys? They didn't do it.
But
50 games in a championship deciding game is the way it's termed.
Wow. That's a lot. Yeah. And it's probably, they don't refer to it because nobody remembers the St. Louis Hawks.
Yeah, well, MVP 4 times in the All-Star game when you had to earn it, not like today when they decide before the game who they're going to make the All-Star.
He also has a great little story very similar to that of Michael Jordan, in that he couldn't make his high school basketball team in his freshman or sophomore years, but he never quit. He never quit.
Right.
In fact, he led his high school team to a state championship in his senior year. Again, he didn't make the school team in his freshman or sophomore years, but finally made it in his senior year, I guess actually in his junior year, and then led his team in his senior year to the state championship. He was filling out his body. He was growing, and he had an intensity about him. And I saw a great quote about him by Bill Russell, who said, Bob made second effort a part of the sports vocabulary. He kept coming at you more than any man in the game. He was always battling for position, fighting you off the boards. Man, Pettit had no quit in him, did he? And that might have been the biggest part of his game, how fierce a competitor he was. Talk about that.
Well, a good example was when they played the Celtics. The Hawks overall did very well against the Celtics, and in particular, Bob had his best games, his highest scoring games. He averaged over 30 points a game against the Celtics.
Wow.
Through his career.
Huh.
And the best story Red Auerbach told me was, he said, we'd be playing the Hawks, and of course Bob is making his baskets, doing his rebounds, doing the whole thing, and by the third quarter, Bill Russell, who's guarding him, he said, we called timeout, and Bill Russell drags himself over to the bench, and he's got his hands gripped on the bottom of his shorts, and he's breathing hard, and Red said, what's wrong? And he said, Red, you need to get another damn player to follow him around. I cannot do it.
That's awesome.
And that's the way he was. Imagine if there was a three-point line. That's why I think all the records need to be separated, actually, because there was such a difference in the game. There was no three-point line. So you say these guys today have all these thousands of points. Well, these guys in those days shot much further out from the basket than the guys today.
Yeah.
They shoot at 17 feet out today. In those days, a 25-footer was a normal shot.
Yeah, that's true.
And all those guys would have a lot more points had that existed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, there was a moment, I think, when Ben Kerner, who owned the Hawks, thought about shipping Pettit to the New York Knicks. What stopped him from doing so, and did that move ultimately affect Kerner's ability to keep the team in St. Louis?
Well, yeah, I think the St. Louis Mafia probably took care of that. But Ben was to the point, he was a little old man, lived with his mother, and gotten to the point where he was fearful that hockey, again, was going to take away his income. Mm-hmm. And that his only hope is to find somebody to buy the team. And actually, he offered it to every St. Louis entity he could. He just didn't run off to Atlanta. Guys who are here today, one group's called the Lou Fuse Automotive Group. They're gigantic. They were there then. They were Hawk sponsors, and they refused them. The brewery, of course, had the Cardinals, so they didn't want it. Then our grocery store chain, which now has almost every store in town, called the Schnucks stores, they turned him down. And nobody in the government structure got involved, and so he thought he was on an island.
Right.
And said, you know, I don't know how many more years I can do this. I don't know how many years I'm going to live. And it's too bad because, boy, could he have made a lot more money.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, he sold it for $3 million.
Right. And he was turning a profit. But before we go back to that, how about this? How much do you think Bob Pettit's legacy is affected by the fact that he played in St. Louis and St. Louis no longer has an NBA franchise?
Oh, yeah, no question. All of the old Hawks are just like the NFL now that we don't have an NFL team. We had some great teams in the 60s and 70s,
sure,
and we know them, and they live here. But, you don't get mention of them very often. Of course, what if Bob had played on an East Coast team?
Yeah, like if they had
a lot more publicity. I mean, he would have been the superstar.
Yeah, I mean, if Kerner had shipped him off to New York to play for the Knicks, I think his legacy would be that much larger. What about Cliff Hagan? Tell us a little bit about Cliff.
Well, Cliff always played second fiddle to Bob, but he enjoyed that role. They were best of pals, and of course, Cliff Hagan was great to have around because otherwise Bob would have never had less than two men on him at all times. But Hagan had to be guarded closely because he could score as well. He patented his famous hook shot, running towards the baseline near the corner, and he would hook it, his right-handed hook shot, and make it all the time. He'd hook the ball from everywhere. And does anybody in the NBA have a hook shot today? I don't think so. I haven't seen one, a true hook shot.
No, I think,
under the basket, a little tiny hook. But there's nobody from the head of the key hooking the ball.
No. No.
It doesn't happen. And Hagen was a great rebounder, and he was a tough guy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was a tough guy, and he'd drive down lane, switch hands, and he could lay it up under the basket either way. He was a real catalyst, and there were many, many games where he picked Bob up, where Bob wasn't having a good night. You know, there were plenty of nights, too, that Bob scored 10 or 15 points, but then Hagen had 25.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they were the twosome. They were the fearsome twosome in the league in those years.
Mm-hmm. But they also had Ed McCauley with them. Talk about Ed.
Yeah, but Ed became a substitute. He wasn't when he got here. He'd again been 7 years in, and it wasn't long. Well, Ed McCauley was put on the bench by Cliff Hagan.
Yeah.
And while Ed was alive, he was one of my best friends in the world. We really miss him, but he would kid and say all the time, he'd say, that Hagan put me on the bench, and it was the best thing that Alex Hannum ever did.
and speaking,
put me on the bench and get him out there.
And speaking of Alex Hannum, tell us a little bit about him.
Well, obviously he was a fireball. He was a great defender. I mean, Alex would come in and defensive. He was a player coach like many guys were. Mm-hmm. And he would come in at times where they knew they needed to shut somebody down or just play defense, the key point of the game. I mean, the best story of Han, and he was just a loud guy, a drinking guy, which Ben Kerner didn't care for all that, but he did care for what Hannon brought to the table as a coach. But it was in that 56-57 championship series against the Celtics, and we could have won two. See, we should have won two of these, but twice in the double overtime, we gave up the lead and lost. And the one that's the best story was we're down 125 to 123 in the second overtime in Boston, and the Hawks called a timeout. They had to go the length of the floor, and Hannum's calling a play, and he said, "Bob, here's the deal. You go down to the other end of the court. You stand under the basket. As soon as I release the ball, you move to the head of the key, and I'm going to hit the backboard. The ball will then hit the rim, and then you can tip it in." And he said, Slater, Martin, and Bob just cracked up. And they said, "Alex, you couldn't hit the ocean with the ball. How are you going to do this?" Because he was a terrible shooter. He said, "Oh, just do it. Just do it." Well, he did it. He took Hagan out of the game, by the way, and replaced himself in the Hagan spot. And sure enough, he throws the ball, and it's on video. You can see it online, I believe, on video, actually.
Oh, wow.
And the ball hits the backboard, and it rolls around the rim. And Bob is a step away, and he taps it too hard, and it just rolls off. Or at least we'd have been in triple overtime.
Wow.
That's a good one. That's a really good story in NBA history.
I want to ask you about one more person in regards to the Hawks. He wasn't there with the team when they won the championship, but he is a key figure in their history, and that's Lenny Wilkens. What can you tell us about Lenny?
Well, Lenny's a good story, and what a great gentleman he is and is today, and a Hall of Famer. Lenny was at Providence, and in fact, at Providence, he had beaten our St. Louis University Billikens in the NIT just the year before. Then the Hawks draft him, much to the chagrin of Ben Kerner, who didn't think he was any good. And Paul Seymour was our coach at that time, and he drafts Lenny. I believe it's 1960-61. And he said, "All right, you drafted him, but don't play him." And Paul said, "I didn't draft him not to play him." He said, "I'm telling you, I'm going to fire you if you play him." So he didn't play. He didn't play for a while, and then it was in December, I don't know how many games into the season they were, when finally he had to play because they had injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to play the whole game, and it was in New York. It was with the Knicks. And Lenny scored over 20 points, had like 8 or 10 assists. And after the game, the reporters came up to Ben, and they were going to nail him on this. Why hasn't he been playing before? And Ben says, "Hey, I love Lenny Wilkens. He should be in the lineup every day." By golly, I'm going to talk to the coach. This is crazy. And of course, Lenny was great while he was here.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, he didn't get to enjoy a championship here. He did in Seattle, but not here.
Right.
But he was he was a tremendous player. He actually put, I think it was Al Ferrari, who was the guard, the other guard at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and he moved Al out basically because of what he was. Great ball handler, great shooter,
Mm-hmm.
and left-handed, which was an advantage. You didn't see many of those.
Right.
And could defend. He could do it all. He was certainly on the All Hawks team that we selected,
Mm-hmm.
Which is all part of the book.
Right, right. You know, all these great players, all these great seasons, and yet St. Louis couldn't hold on to the team. Heck, they even played all-star games in St. Louis. And
Yeah, we got an award. I've got the big thing. It's a big brass basketball on a stand in the basement, and it was awarded to Ben Kerner for his outstanding in conducting the All-Star games, for such an outstanding job of putting them on and promoting them, because they weren't going over real well in other cities. So consequently, we got 3 All-Star games in 7 years.
Right. I mean, and again, I go back to, they couldn't hold on to the team. Why did Ben want to sell the team? And why was it so hard to find local ownership?
It just makes no sense, and that's where I think that the race card was here, and maybe some of those business leaders were reluctant, and there was so much upkeep needed to the building.
Yeah, how much did Kiel
which was
Auditorium
eventually torn down.
Yeah, how much did Kiel Auditorium play a role in the Hawks leaving? Because, like you said, the Blues come in, they're going to play in St. Louis Arena. Eventually, Chicago sends the football Cardinals to St. Louis. They make out okay, and they just, the Hawks just couldn't find their way in St. Louis. It's baffling. And do you think maybe had they had more success in those championships against the Celtics, that they might have stayed in St. Louis instead of moving to Atlanta?
Oh, no, yeah, no question. If they had won that second championship, and again, if just one civic-minded person stepped up and said, Ben, I'll join you. Don't buy it from him, just join him and be a co-owner. They had Marty Blake, who became, almost a Hall of Famer himself, and he originated the role of scout, of recruiting college basketball players. I mean, nobody did that. Marty started it. Mm-hmm. And the Hawks were recruiting guys that nobody ever heard of because there was no TV, and you'd have to literally get on a train or a plane and go find these guys and watch them play. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he was a big help in getting these players here. So, yeah, it was one of the saddest days as a young boy in our lives. We woke up and heard that the Hawks were going to leave, and of course the NBA immediately promised that St. Louis will have another team within 5 years. Well, good luck with that one. How'd that work out?
Yeah, no, obviously it didn't. The other interesting thing is that Kerner had sort of given up on selling the team, and then here comes this guy from Atlanta, and Kerner doesn't even take him seriously. He says, yeah, all right, I'll talk to him. And instead of taking him to a nice lunch or a nice dinner, he takes him downstairs in his office building for a hot dog and chili or something like that.
Yeah, right. And he turned down a New Orleans group. He'd already turned them down.
Yeah, and But this guy in Atlanta, I think his name was Tom Cousins or something like that.
Yes, Tom Cousins.
He was as serious as a heart attack. He wanted the Hawks. He has a hot dog and chili with Kerner. A week later, they're talking about a real deal, and bam, the St. Louis Hawks
because he was building
gone.
the Omni,
right? He needed a team.
the
there.
arena in the shopping center, and he wanted a team. It was the easiest one to get.
How about the players? How did they react?
Some of them didn't go. Lenny didn't go.
Pettit
Lenny
didn't go
told
either.
Cousins
right?
away. He said, "Trade me because I'm not going to Atlanta. I'm not going to set one foot in Atlanta." And Bob was gone.
Yep.
Bob laughs today. He got his jersey in the rafters, and they had him down for a big ceremony. And he said, I'd never played here, ever. Now, Hagen did. Hagen was the only one who went.
Uh-huh.
And then he went on to actually be a star in the ABA. He went to the ABA.
Yeah, he played for,
The
I think, the
Dallas
Dallas Chaparrals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Has there
So
ever,
it all split up.
yeah, has there ever been talk about bringing a team to St. Louis, an expansion franchise, or relocating a team? Why do you think St. Louis has not been talked about more when it comes to the NBA?
Well, I don't think the NBA, I don't think they're going to expand anytime soon. It would have to be a relocation, I believe. And there has been several guys. Now, remember, we actually, when Bill Laurie was owning the Blues, he went after the Sacramento Kings, and he thought he had them. And he was denied late in the going of bringing them to St. Louis because they weren't doing diddly out there.
Right.
And they turned him down. And now there's a guy here, a guy who could buy and sell anybody, a billionaire who's local. And he's sniffing at it, at least. I know that. I've even telling some of my reporter guys that I used to employ, I said, you guys ought to just sniff around this. This guy doesn't need any money. He's a basketball guy. He just watches basketball. And he doesn't need a nickel from anybody. He doesn't need the city to contribute anything. He can use the building downtown, which is great for it. And he just got to get a team willing to come. And at least he's looking at it. I don't think it hurts the hockey team in any way. I think you're talking about different audiences.
Sure.
And besides that, the people who have the hockey arena would just as soon have another tenant.
And that's really how basketball started anyway, was
right.
the original 6 owners of the teams in the National Hockey League were trying to figure out a way to make money on the nights that their hockey team was out of town. So they needed something. So they came up with basketball. It's
sure.
That's crazy.
No, I think it'd be great. I mean, it's scary what's happened here in St. Louis with these teams, and of course, the Rams going to LA was not our fault,
right?
At all. We offered to do everything, but Kroenke just wanted to be a Hollywood hero, and so we lose the Rams, and now we're apparently close to getting a MLS team, but that's quite a bit different.
It's not
a 22,000 seat stadium that plays 13 games a year at home. That's not the same.
Yeah, it's not the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, or the NFL.
Right.
It's not one of the 4 majors. Hey, Greg, I want to thank you so much for joining me on Sports Forgotten Heroes. You've been a terrific guest, and we never really covered it, but tell us a little bit about the St. Louis Sports Hall of Fame.
Well, it's great. After my escapades, all the things I'd done, I decided to want to do something at home. Getting older, and I realized that St. Louis didn't have a Sports Hall of Fame. With all our great tradition and history, we didn't have a Hall of Fame. So I just took it upon myself to hold a press conference and say, we're going to have a Hall of Fame. I'm going to do it. And I got help from people. In fact, the Blues stepped up first, but the Cardinals are involved in helping us. And what we do is we nominate and put into the Hall of Fame great amateurs and professionals from Metro St. Louis and Southern Illinois So it gives you a wide range of great athletes. And I mean, we've had from Stan Musial to Bill DeWitt to Joe Torre to Kurt Warner to Dick Vermeil to Bob Pettit, Hagen, all the Hawks who are even ones now who have deceased. So we've and a lot of local great amateurs. It's been a great run. It's 10 years old, and we've got a big year planned ahead, and hoping to finalize a deal to move into a new facility.
Oh, cool!
In this year, so it's great, and people can have some fun and look at our website, stlouissportshallofame.com. Real simple.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll see a beautiful website that tells the history of all St. Louis sports and all of we've done, and pictures of the players, interviews, videos. Lots of things are on it. And if you're a Hawks fan, I've got 2 books that I know you can find on Amazon.
You can. Tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, Full Court was the first one I did, the Untold Stories of the St. Louis Hawks. And it's a day-by-day chronicle that's really kind of fun to read, because I've got all the goofy stories and fun stories, talking to players from the Celtics and the Lakers and the Hawks, and it's really kind of entertaining book. And the second one is called The St. Louis Hawks, a Gallery of Images and Memorabilia, and it's a coffee table book with just some stunning pictures in it, because they are the original pictures taken by the only photographer that Ben Kerner ever allowed down on the court during a game to take the pictures. And you can see the sweat beads roll off their arms here 60 years later.
Cool.
Clear as a bell, because he had lights on the court and he was the only guy. I wrote the second book because of him. He called me and he said, "Why didn't you use my pictures in the first book?" I said, "First of all, I didn't know you had them." And I said, "Sure, I'll do another book that's basically the photography, and it's gorgeous." And these books have sold very, very well.
Very cool. So, the Hawks moved to St. Louis from Milwaukee for the 1955-56 season and stayed through the 1967-68 season. And I think it's safe to say those were the best years in the history of the Hawks franchise. During their time in St. Louis, they appeared in 4 NBA championships and won the title in 1958. As Greg and I spoke about, the team had one of the NBA's true legends in Hall of Famer Bob Pettit, who would probably be way better known had the Hawks remained in St. Louis. The fact that the city had been promised a new franchise immediately after the Hawks left, and they were promised a new franchise on a few other occasions, only to come up short for whatever reason, is a real head-scratcher. Although Greg did mention a few potential reasons why, and they're not very pretty. And that's a shame, because St. Louis is truly one of our great cities, and when its fans get behind its teams, like the Cardinals and the Blues, it makes for a great atmosphere. Next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes, we're going to talk about one of the NHL's true legends, a guy whose name is rarely mentioned in the same breath as many of the league's greatest defensemen, but it should be when you consider what he did over the course of a long career for the Detroit Red Wings and the Toronto Maple Leafs. Red Kelly. That's next time. For now, thanks again to today's guest, Greg Maracek, and we'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.